Well, welcome to this discussion on the art and science of impact investing. Delighted to bring you today an expert panel to discuss the key issues from this field. As always with PCD content, we love to hear from our members. Let us know, those watching with us on Zoom or indeed on YouTube. Love to hear your comments, questions and thoughts. We're looking out for those and we'll bring them to our expert speakers as we move through the session today. But just to frame this topic and to understand a little bit more about the things we're going to discuss over the course of the next 60 minutes, I'd like to welcome first Sally Tennant, OBE, who's a founder of Acorn Capital Advisers. Welcome, Sally. Oh, you're on mute, Sally.
It's fantastic, isn't it? Welcome. I would start that way. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, David.
Thank you. So you tabled this topic for our members today. I mean, it'd be interesting to hear a little bit more about why you think it's an important topic and what Acorn Capital Advisers adds to this discussion and debate.
So I think that the pandemic and what people have lived through over the past 18 months, almost 2 years now, has really pushed purpose to the top of the agenda. And kind of why is that? And I think that the tough times we've lived through have really highlighted not just health inequalities, but societal inequalities. And next to that, you've got high net worth individuals, families, family offices who are far better off than they were 2 years ago. And climate change at the same time has also got top of the agenda. And that for the next generation is a big issue. So now you find that the conversations and what we're finding with our clients, it's not just about profit, but it's about profit with purpose.
Is there more momentum now behind these topics? Things like COP26, meaning it's all over the media. I mean, do you think those things help advisors, prompt and start these conversations, or make them table it more with their clients?
Yes, although I think one does have to remember that individuals and families are at different stages on that spectrum. So some are very alive to the conversations that are happening, and we certainly have found that our families have either put the purpose on the agenda or are very receptive to it. So the conversation has moved from ESG to purpose. But just to put it into perspective, and the fact that people are coming from different places, if you think about purpose 100 years ago, 80 years ago, purpose was survival. 2 world wars, hyperinflation, your purpose was to just get through it. Post-war, your kind of purpose was, preservation. Let's just make sure we can get through inflation, high taxes, and just preserve what we've got. And as times got better, it was more at the turn of the century to this century, it was more growth, growth, growth. And now it's very much more around that plus purpose. We should give back. There are some tough issues out there, but not everyone is in that space.
Okay, and at Acorn, you work with different types of advisors, family offices, trustees, law firms. Perhaps give us a sense of the different types of professionals you might collaborate with around this discussions.
Absolutely. So we're independent wealth advisors. We don't manage money ourselves, but we really help our clients get the best out of their managers, ensuring that we collaborate both with accountants, with lawyers, with other family office advisors on the philanthropic side as well. And really how we work with them, and I'll be teasing more out of Catherine later and Ethan, is really helping families think through partly their heritage, but also where they want to get to and how they can have those conversations in a way that allows them to have a common strategy. Because what we've found is that a few years ago, you had your philanthropic pot, you had your giving away, you had your investments here, and in another bucket, you had your business. Now, how we work is really to try and work at putting together a holistic strategy so that purpose infiltrates and becomes part of that DNA and part of what people are doing and thinking about day to day.
Okay, terrific. Well, Sally, we're going to co-host this session. So you're going to speak with Catherine and Ethan on the art side of this discussion, and then I'm going to come back over and discuss with Matt and Amy further details on the scientific aspects of the impact debate. So over to you, Sally.
Thank you. So before I start quizzing you both, Ethan and Catherine, maybe I should introduce you to our audience. So I'll start with Catherine because I will start questioning her first. So Catherine, you and I first met when you were at KPMG and went in to build the family office practice. Now Catherine heads up BDO's family office services group. And so you work with families from the beginning of their journey, halfway through and through to succession as well, helping them build family offices, have the right governance and philanthropic strategies. And I know you're very, very passionate about engaging your families with meaning and with purpose. And to that end, not only are you members of STEP, but also the Purposeful Planning Institute and Philanthropic Centre. So that's terrific. So it's great to have you on the panel. Ethan, whom I've known more on the investment side of things, has had a really interesting career, predominantly starting off his life in consultancy, then moving to Partners Capital, where he headed up research and advised and was a sort of family office advisor or manager of funds for family offices. He then moved sides and set up the family office for Dyson, then went to Chicago to look after a prominent family in America, looking after both, again, their investments, but also thinking about their strategies around impact. And now London is very blessed to have him back because he's the Chief Investment Officer of Guy's and St Thomas's Foundation, which is a 1 billion foundation with a huge impact remit that he'll talk about later. So we're thrilled that you're both here. So let's get going, Catherine. So I wanted to start with you and to sort of cross-check, because we find that when we work with families, it's really important to sort of build consensus and shared purpose and values. And with that, you know, it sets the foundation for an impact strategy. Do you think that without a collaborative process, there's a real risk of dissent and lack of buy-in? And what happens with your families and what do you do to build that? What works? And what are the road traffic accidents that people should think about who are listening today? That's your first question.
Thank you, Sally, and thank you for the kind introduction as well. Hopefully you can hear me. I've had to switch to headphones because it's a bit of a noisy environment here. I am in the office today. So, I mean, firstly, I completely agree on the importance of purpose and it being the foundation on which all the planning and all the conversations I have with the families I work with are built. Because I work with families, so it might be an entrepreneur that's created the wealth and they then want to think about the next generation, or it might be an existing family group. The point being, it's more than one individual, and therefore it's really important to understand and make sure that they're speaking the same language, you know, on the same page, before you start then building structures, strategies, approaches, whether it's in relation to their family office, whether it's their investment strategy or anything else they may do. And the first point I'd make is that people generally don't like things being done to them. Like my 4-year-old doesn't like it. So certainly the clients and the families I work with don't like it. So they want to be involved and feel like they have had some input into their future and what the future of their family and the legacy is, whether it's looking at an investment portfolio or, as you say, looking like across that spectrum at the business and maybe their philanthropy as well. And when you've got a group of individuals, a lack of control by any one person is a real downside of having that pooled family capital. No one person is master of their own destiny. They need to work together. I think in terms of how you go about doing that, the most important thing is to actually make purpose tangible and relevant to the families, because it can feel very theoretical, great, we've got a purpose, what the difference is that going to make? And I was working with one family group quite recently, and for them we were talking exactly about this, and they're like, well, we've got the purpose, we'll group our assets together and we'll get better financial returns. I said, well, that's great. Well, who's going to be making those decisions for you? Is it going to be an investment advisor? Is it going to be a committee or a board? How well do they know what your family views are on different points? And we had a couple of examples. So they have within that group some direct investments into different businesses. And I said, well, how would you feel, it was topical at the time, if one of your businesses was investing in China, in the region we've heard about with the Uyghurs, and using cotton that may or may not be produced by them. It was a very live example that potentially related to what they did. And they'd never really thought about that before, but they certainly had very strong views personally on it. And so my question is, so how important is it that the decision makers understand what you're about, your family values, and your approach to these decisions?
So Catherine, that raises an interesting point about when not everyone has the same passion and they have different views. What do you do to make sure there isn't some terrible blow up and you can build consensus?
Yeah, well, I think firstly, there are different degrees of collaboration. And I think it's worth mentioning that, because often what puts people off having these broad family discussions, particularly when there are multiple generations, is that the senior generation, in some instances, doesn't necessarily want to cede control and give up all their decision-making power. So you might find that where there's a family board, for example. And so to understand that you can allow family members to be informed and to influence the decision-making without necessarily everyone having to have an equal say, you still achieve some of the benefits of collaboration. And the right format will depend on the family and their circumstances. Now, I've worked with a few where the next generation are in their 20s, and in that instance, they did have some views on strong views on some things, and it was really important to hear those, but they weren't necessarily going to be making all the decisions. But I think, more generally, it's easier to get consensus if you're dealing with a family business than it is when you're looking at the sort of totality of assets of a family office, because you might have got philanthropic strategy, investments, and so really to understand what the different outlets are for people's passions. If people feel strongly about particular points, will it affect everything the family does, or can that be accommodated in one particular area? Are there certain red flag decisions that need to go to a full family vote because they are so fundamentally important, versus others where, having given a general approach, you can delegate and allow those decisions?
So
and
one last quick question before I move on to Ethan is around, okay, so having done that, what about implementation, and what are those hurdles around implementation? Because that's a good segue to Ethan, to my first question to Ethan.
Yeah, so I'd say there are sort of three hurdles that I think stop people, particularly when we're talking about impact and their investments, as that sort of is one sort of flow on from the purpose discussion. So firstly, the senior gen, not always the senior, but often the senior gen doesn't buy into the idea. Secondly, they can have skepticism and concern over how to measure impact if the family decide to go down an impact strategy. And then there are questions about whether there are sufficient investments, whether this is greenwashing and things like that. And the latter 2 points, I think I would certainly leave to Ethan. He'll be far more expert at dealing with. But just in terms of the first one, so the senior generation doesn't buy into the idea of an impact strategy at all. Again, you have to tailor the approach to families, but you can sometimes start small. So enable one pot of capital, for example, to test it out so the family can learn and start to understand the different influences. And I've seen that done, and very quickly, actually, you get buy-in when people realise the implications of the approach and the sort of decision making. Also, education is really key for everybody, because it is, for most people, a relatively new field. And there are courses, but there are also some great free resources like Philanthropy Impact have a great series, Walk in My Shoes, that covers not just philanthropy, but social impact. they can also speak to their peers. And in the worst case scenario, an individual, if they can't get buy-in from the family, they can see if they can get a degree of capital appointed out to them so that they can do it on their own. It's that fundamentally important to them.
Those are really, really good suggestions. Thank you, and we'll make a note of those. So Ethan, once a family has identified its purpose and impact goals, how do you implement a strategy that can kind of harness both profit and purpose?
Well, I think that touches on probably the most profound point that I would observe from the perspective of guys, and that is that there just isn't, as we go forward, a distinction between the pool of wealth and the impact that it has. I mean, the old model of, go back 150 years to the golden era of philanthropy with the Carnegie and Vanderbilts and so forth, and, made all their money. And then, as they went later into life, decided to pass it on in charitable causes. Now, what's very clear is that you can and should have positive impact with your pool of wealth. Whether that's the way you operate your core operating business, should you have one, or the way you invest the assets that are not driving the operating business, you not only can you have impact with everything that you do, but you probably should. And I think we've seen that with, I would point to a couple of specific examples. Climate change has turned out to reveal some very profitable opportunities and some very unprofitable areas to avoid, such as, renewable energy, tripled in 2020 after doing not a lot for 5 years. So that was clearly a great place to allocate your portfolio. In the previous 5 years, everyone thought energy was going to be a great place to invest, particularly oil and gas production after the oil price crash of 2014, 2015, but nobody made any money. Well, not nobody, but it was not a great place to be for the last 5 years, because too much capital was there and the demand profile and expectations in the market were changing as the world recognized that demand for hydrocarbons was on a different path over the next 20 years. So you took account of environmental considerations in your portfolio and did well. You avoided loss and you made money. So I think it's just a different ballgame. And we as professional investors can see that, and we can see those opportunities and really have a role to play helping families understand that the trade-offs are just not what they thought it was. So, generation one that made the money and is skeptical needs to be educated in the same way that generations 2, 3, 4, will have instincts, but possibly not the tools and techniques and understanding of how to invest properly. And so as the professional, you can help them do that. I think sorry, go ahead, Phil.
On that though, because I think you raise this and it's such an important point, and we've seen that in conversations about, gosh, can you really get enough opportunities to have profitable investments and impact? So what can families do to measure and assess whether they've met those impact goals that they've set? How do you go about doing that?
So this is absolutely critical, to make sure that, in the same way you measure the profit of a portfolio, you measure its impact and its achievement of other objectives. And of course, I tend to think about portfolios as being multidimensional. You have cash flow, liquidity, all sorts of different requirements, and you build it to optimize for those things. Impact is just another metric. You have to be very clear about what it is you're trying to achieve, what you care about, what is the purpose, what is the impact that you want to have. If you want to, for example, eradicate disease from third world countries, for example, as Chris Hone and his foundation have undertaken, then that's fine. But once you've defined that, then you need to develop the metrics which you think relate to that, that are in fact measurable. And there's numerous constructs out there from different organizations about ways to measure them. No one is particularly better than another. There's not a standard, but they're all out there. They're all free. You just have to be clear in your own mind about what is the route to impact. I think I want to impact X. That's my objective. How do I think I impact that? And the example with Guys in St. Thomas is a good one, where we're all about investing in a healthier society. We want to improve health outcomes, particularly for underserved urban populations. We want to really address the health inequalities that we've seen over the last 10 years and have become very stark during COVID. And as you look at the way to impact those unequal health outcomes, what you soon realize is that the social and economic circumstances of those populations are the key driver of those health outcomes. So affordable housing, good employment, financial inclusion, good nutrition. These are the critical inputs to improved health outcome for those populations. So having done that work, which is not, we've done a lot of it at the foundation over the years, but others have as well. So it's out there to be found and understood. Having identified that, we've said that's the route to impact. Not only are we going to invest in healthcare and healthcare solutions, such as better medicines, better technologies, better service delivery, but we're also going to invest in the social determinants of health, which are particularly affecting less and underserved populations. And so we've identified that route to impact. Then it's a lot easier to measure if you're having an effect on those causes.
So Ethan, before I hand over to David, one last question on this, which is around portfolio construction here. How has your asset allocation changed to take account for the fact that in some areas there will be concessionary returns, social housing as an example, or a longer time frame before the impact comes out? So how do you manage it to make sure you get the returns that you were set out to do, which are in the objects of that foundation?
So I think this is, we can come back to the broader point, which is you always have to ask yourself, what's the purpose of the money, right? And if you set up a foundation to have a positive impact, let's say it's on health, for example, then you have to think more broadly than just, I'm going to maximize return with my pool of assets such that I can give away every year a larger and larger amount of funding to make grants for philanthropic purposes, because your assets can have that impact as well. And if you can, if, for example, as we face today, a period of potentially subdued returns compared to the last 10 years, you want to be asking the question, do I really want to be reinvesting every last pound note into a market which isn't offering me great opportunities, when in fact I could put that money to work having impact, which is going to change lives today, and the compounding benefit of that impact over the next 10 years could be very powerful compared to more pedestrian markets. That's a philosophical question. We'll leave that to one side. In terms of building an actual portfolio that does it, look, it's just an engineering and construction job. It's like building any portfolio for any purpose. If you didn't care about impact on a particular objective, you would still be, we as the practitioners would be doing the same exact thing. We would be looking at every potential asset that's out there and how it contributes to the objectives of the portfolio. And what we've found is that two things that are important. One is, interestingly, you can get paid for impact investments. There are mechanisms to get paid, and affordable housing for vulnerable populations is a good one. The government pays for that because it has to, and so it should. But if we can do it better, or if the organizations that we support through financial investment, enhancing their balance sheet, they can then do that better, they will accrue returns, and the excess return that they accrue can come back to us as investors. And there's multiple fund managers that are set up to help support that kind of mechanism. Social outcome bonds is another example where this is the case. And will you make 20% returns on those investments? Probably not, but you probably don't need to either. You may have other investments that make the 20%. And as long as you are rigorous about quantifying what you can achieve financially and the impact from each investment, you will be able to build a portfolio that has significant impact. And we're taking this over the next several years as far as we can. Our trial, so to speak, in impact investing started at 5% allocation of the endowment. We're just moving it now to 10%. But the point is really, are we going to take this to 100%? And I mean, we are going to take it to 100%. The question is how? And of course, there's critical challenges there. The biggest one is the measurement point you asked in the first instance.
I think Ethan, that's a whole topic in itself, the measurement, and there is a huge amount of work. And actually, I think it's very exciting. I was attending a lunch yesterday around the measurement, and I think that it's not a bad segue into the more science part now of this discussion. And I'd like to introduce Matt, who's got a lot of talents. And there are three things about you, Matt, which I think are really great. You've worked as a solicitor. He is, by the way, a partner at Wedlake, where you have been since 2018. But you've worked in the country, you've worked in the UK, in London, I mean, and you've worked on all aspects of private client work in terms of trust, succession, wills, planning, and I think it's particularly interesting that you actually decided to go to BDO and look at the tax side for a few years. So you have that added value of having worked on that side, which must be terrific for your clients. And I particularly like the fact that you're co-chair of your firm's social mobility network, which is giving opportunities for young people from more disadvantaged or different backgrounds to be able to become solicitors. So I think that's terrific. So over to you, David.
Thank you, and welcome, Matt. Great to have you on the panel today. I noticed that you're one of the younger generation of partners in London, particularly, that's engaging a lot on this topic on social media. There's a lot written about this field, particularly for the offshore fiduciary world. Be interesting to just get from you, before we get into some of the details, your interest in this space and how you see it developing.
I think it's, well, thank you very much for the kind introduction. I never expected that, so that's great. It's something that a group of those sort of next generation partners amongst us have identified as important, really, because you're having these meaningful discussions with clients, but then part of much like this session, really, it's structured whereby you're having the discussions and you're working with the family's advisors, but how do you then plug your strategies into a meaningful plan and something that you can implement in practice? And what's quite apparent is that you're working with, particularly in the context of trusts, very outmoded duties and framework, really, to be able to try and achieve that. So I think there's a sort of general consensus, that there's as a next generation sort of partner working with next gen clients, more in tune with the values that they are exhibiting, for one thing, and realizing that we should be having that voice on their behalf rather than people necessarily seeing it as a problem. The next gen being a problem, it's about embracing the opportunity. So that's one thing. And I think then moving on to the fiduciary market and realizing actually there is change to be had, whether that's full-scale roots and branch law changes or just incremental changes of mindset, is something that I think we're only now just sort of tackling and getting to grips with. So today's session is definitely useful in bringing some of those issues together.
Great, thank you. And also going to bring Amy Blackwell in, partner at Acorn Capital Advisers, for some thoughts, because you commonly work with the fiduciary market as well, don't you, Amy? So you're going to share some reflections as we chat with Matt through some of the more detailed issues around impact investing.
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm actually representing Paul Hunter today, and he's the group head of family office services for Crestbridge in Jersey. And he was supposed to be here today to provide his insight, but had an unexpected conflict. So I have his notes here that he sent me. So if it looks like I'm looking at notes, it's because I want to make sure that I give him credit for actually what he wanted me to say. So if it's brilliant, Paul said it, and if it's controversial, I'll take credit for that. So, yes. So fire away.
Thanks.
To Paul.
Well, Matt, just coming to you first. I mean, the wall of capital that is held in offshore structures that could be put into impact purposes, there's a huge opportunity there, and a lot of the debate that goes on in the professional press is around the struggle, the conflict that trustees might face, particularly for historic structures, around permitting impact investment, or them being the trustees being allowed to invest in potentially illiquid investments or where returns may or may not be compromised. How do you see that, and how trustees respond to this challenge with historic structures that are there already in place?
I think it's a very real concern, and you only have to look at trustees, historic ones, to realise why. You're not going to see a trustee that was written 10, 20, 100 of years ago anticipating this change in mindset around investment. And then you sort of, if you can't rely on the trustee, do you look at the trust law, and certainly under the Trustee Act in the UK, under English law, it's very, very general, doesn't necessarily give us anything to provide trustees with any degree of confidence that they can pursue perhaps a non-financial mandate within their investments. And then turning to fiduciary duties, what duties are trustees under? Well, there's a general sort of fiduciary duty to act in the best interests of your beneficiaries, which is, well, great. Well, what does that mean in practice? And historically, we've turned to case law to try and determine what that means, particularly in the context of investments. And one of the leading cases, which I think sort of starkly puts the position into, sort of really brings home the position, is the case of Cowan and Scargo under English law, where it says that if you have a trust that is primarily for the financial benefit of beneficiaries, well, those private trusts are going to have that as their aim. You're looking at the best financial return for your beneficiaries, and that's the duty that you need to uphold. So trustees may look at that and think, well, am I achieving the best financial return for my beneficiaries if I pursue this impact strategy? And conceptually, am I just benefiting my beneficiaries by pursuing an impact objective? Because of course, the flip side of any impact investing is that you're making a financial commitment, but equally you're benefiting potentially non-beneficiaries of the trust. And how does that square with your duties of loyalty? So I think there's a lot of red flags for trustees to overcome, or try to overcome, if they're going to truly embrace an impactful strategy as part of their investments.
Okay, thanks. Amy, what were Paul's thoughts around this area as someone in the trenches as a trustee?
Well, Paul's view, obviously the ideal situation is when the settler of the trust is still here, and you can have conversations about intent and come to conclusions. But in instances where the settler has passed away, especially when there are competing influences from different beneficiaries, different risk profiles, and different attitudes toward impact, they really do like to look for external professional advice, and oftentimes will go out and get impact specialists, investment managers to come in and talk about, what are ways to mitigate against concessionary returns by diversifying assets in those portfolios, or they'll bring in an independent consultants advisory firm to come in and really get to the bottom of the beneficiary's reluctance and fear, to see if maybe some of that can be dissuaded, and there can be an overarching investment plan that allows for impact investing, similar to what Ethan was saying, is a percentage of the pot that may grow over time as comfort level grows and evidence grows. But they like to make sure that everyone is getting a voice, and they may not get full consensus, but at least it's then part of a growth process for the family.
Thanks. Matt, is there a risk there if trustees don't consider a sustainable, not necessarily full impact investments, but sustainable and ESG themes within the portfolios, that actually there's a risk there that beneficiaries in the future will see trustees presiding over the wrong portfolios of assets that don't consider these factors. That it's not just risk one way, is it, for trustees? And how do they document the way they set their processes out? Do they need to table these things with clients and make sure that's properly, that there's risks from many sides?
I see trustees, in some ways, the analogy of between the devil and the deep blue sea is a good one, because you might take the attitude, well, let's just pursue our financial agenda that we've done historically. It's always worked in the past, so why change things now? It achieves the objectives identified under the trust deed and by the settlor, where you can't have those discussions with the settlor now. But by doing so, you risk being questioned by the next generation of beneficiaries, who might wonder, why didn't you adopt a more impactful strategy earlier on? And often, as we realize ourselves, we're at this impasse where there's this clear generational succession of wealth. Not only are we moving wealth from the current generation to the next, but it represents that divergence of values between generations. So I think trustees can't avoid addressing these issues and simply deciding that then going to ignore them, because I don't think they can. How do they embrace them? One point that Amy's picked up via Paul is around achieving consensus amongst your beneficiary group, actively having communication amongst your family, and as Catherine and Ethan alluded to, that's incredibly important, creating that foundation and building upon that foundation, and then documenting that in some form of family charter or value statement would at least provide the trustees with the impetus they need to know that they're not going to be, because ultimately they've got a duty to the beneficiaries. If the beneficiaries are all on side, then the risk has somewhat dissipated if they know that the beneficiaries are happy and they're pursuing an impactful strategy and it can be measured. So I think consensus is certainly helpful. The idea of allocating pots is also a good idea. It doesn't compromise necessarily the overall performance of the trust, or if it does, then the beneficiary is on side with that, sort of dipping your toe, as it were, not going for a full roots and branch change in attitude, but just incremental change to develop and build confidence, particularly around the current generation of beneficiaries who are receiving distributions and perhaps more reliant on those distributions. So I think there's certainly steps need to be taken.
Okay, thanks. And Amy, we put a question to Paul about the views of beneficiaries and accommodating for them in terms of their well-being and accommodating that within the trust. I mean, what was his view on how much trustees should consider those kind of arguments?
Yes, I mean, the conversation that Paul and I were having was, does the responsibility of trustees for the well-being of their beneficiaries help to mitigate the risk about potential concessionary returns? And his answer to that really was that historically, well-being of the beneficiaries had a very financial tone to it. And so it kept a very tight, narrow interpretation of what that meant. And he believes that there is a broadening of that lens now, and that it does include a responsibility for being a good global citizen. And there are reputational risks that are bubbling to the surface within these families about, how you are shepherding your wealth for greater good. So he does think that those considerations are coming to the forefront, at least as part of conversations. He didn't necessarily think that it offset risk for trustees, but it certainly is something that can help illuminate the family's views about what well-being means to them.
Okay, thanks. Ethan, just to bring you back in, I mean, do you think that trustees, the conversation's being framed in the wrong way about people thinking about this kind of trade-off? As you say, when you look at the numbers, actually, there's compelling reasons to say that it's just a style of investing that makes long-term sense. How do you think you can get more professionals on the right page with these styles?
Well, I think the professionals have already moved. It would be my observation, and I think the families are moving too. The traditional trust structures for long-term money may not be adapted to it yet, but I look over the last year talking with any number of sort of new family office launches, and I would have said between 30 and 50% of them were targeted on exactly a specific theme of impact and purpose. So I think these things are, for example, one of the Walmart family, the Walton family, is off setting up their own family office, and the whole point is climate change, how they're gonna affect that, and that's just one of many examples. I think so the world is moving that way. The practitioners understand that the power of the importance of incorporating responsible investing principles into the portfolio is absolutely critical. And the example I gave about energy versus oil and gas versus renewable energy was a good one, but there are others. For example, diversity, which is not something that you notice particularly in the financial world normally, certainly amongst major fund managers historically. But the academic research on the performance of diverse owned fund management firms, for example, women and ethnic minority owned firms, has been around for quite a while. The performance on average of those fund managers is better than the benchmarks, better than average. And so, why not support them by allocating to those fund managers? Why not help improve diversity in our industry by actually putting money to work to support those managers?
And interestingly, Ethan, building on that, there are a group of foundations in America who have written to their fund managers and said, unless they have better diversity, they will take their money away, and particularly ethnic diversity, even more than gender. And so they've been proactively saying, unless you address this, we'll give our money to different managers. So it's really picking up the pace.
And one of the fabulous things about it is the way in which it is actually getting people to engage with how their money is being invested, whether they're beneficiaries of trusts or whether they're foundations. It's made it, people are now passionate and want to understand, whereas historically there were probably a small pot of people who were very interested, but the majority were quite divorced from what was going on there. That engagement and that discussion can only be a good thing.
And Catherine, building on that, one of the things that we do and work with clients, which you probably do as well, when we are reviewing managers or managers come to pitch to manage some of the money, is they do a beautiful ESG presentation, and then you ask them whether they would invest in themselves and do they tick those boxes as an organization. What is that? And that's sometimes quite a different conversation, but it does help organizations address it themselves. And then that if they're running their business through that lens, they're more likely to be doing that with their investment. So walking the talk is super important.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't get so granular in terms of the investment managers as you do, but any organizations working with these families, it comes back to the point about them thinking about their wealth holistically, not just the barbell of the investment and the philanthropy, but that whole ecosystem. People not only want to invest well, but understand that the firms they're working with have similar and aligned values. So it really is, you have to start looking first at yourself and then at the other firms that you're working with if you really want to help families and make big changes here.
Yeah.
Thank you. And there's a question here for you, Ethan, in the chat from George King. Thank you, George, for your question. Ethan, how do you manage the impact and community drive of the charity versus the needs, desires, I presume, for income of guys? What's your take on that trade, on that balance there?
Well, I think the critical answer is they're integral. They are the same. The foundation has an overriding purpose to improve health outcomes. And so everything that we do has the objective of trying to support that. Now, as with any organization, I don't think we've achieved it in all aspects of what we do. For example, the endowment assets are not 100% oriented towards health impact as we sit here today. We're increasing the focus of everything we do, but it's not there yet. And like everyone, we have work to do. But I think for example, in our property portfolio, we've inherited a portfolio of directly held properties, which, it wasn't orchestrated strategically. It wasn't brought together with the objective of creating health impact or enhancing the communities, the health and well-being of the communities in which we're located. It's happenstance, but we can reshape that, and with everything that we own, we can take steps to ensure that that the development and the activity of those assets is contributing beneficially towards a health impact objective and towards the health and well-being of the communities in which we serve. Again, I wouldn't say that all the answers are present, but that's what we're thinking about. That's what we're heading towards. That's what we're challenging ourselves to do. And we hope we'll get it right. Inevitably, we won't get it right all the time.
Okay, thank you for that. And Matt, just bringing you back in, we looked at historic structures, but looking at new wealth, new entrepreneurs, people creating wealth in dynamic, knowledge-based sectors, tech and other areas. Do you see different tastes in terms of how they maybe set up some succession planning, set up a new structure, perhaps with more sense of purpose? Is there any trends there that you're observing in practical terms dealing with clients?
Yeah, certainly. And I think some of these issues, these resistant issues, are where you're working with historic structures and, as I said, multiple generations, where you're working with effectively new money. The issues are the same with regards to the next generation values mindset and the desires to have more impact, and that's exhibited. There's a greater sort of toolkit, as it were, for those clients to really go to town in terms of their structures that embrace these issues. You can start from scratch with your trustee. You can hardwire in the need to consider impact and sustainable investing within the powers of the trustee, which is compelling and often is helpful for the clients to overcome that idea of even setting up a structure in the first place. But the clients themselves are certainly minded to put others before themselves, as it were, in terms of their wealth, and they're not just minded to make provision for their nearest and dearest. They're also looking at donor advised funds as part of that succession plan as well. And we're certainly seeing that a lot more in what we're doing. And I think just a general overall acknowledgement that the wealth isn't just about them, it's about a greater purpose.
And it's part of an integrated philanthropy strategy, with people who've they're self-made, made money quickly, to sometimes to large volume, and so they're looking at how they can have this as part of a philanthropy strategy. I mean, Amy, perhaps do you see the same with the newer entrepreneurial wealth and how they approach this area of impact, but also philanthropy?
Well, okay, first I'm going to be Paul.
Okay,
this was the most interesting part of my conversation with him, because he answered this question completely differently than I expected. Because when I asked him how it was dealing with entrepreneurs and fresh structures, and I thought he was going to tell me, whew, it's great, it's so much easier, there's not all these conflicts. And he actually said that they're the most difficult conversations that he has as a trustee, which I found really interesting. And his reason was that they come in and they've been wildly successful, and they have a really strong sense of their own mind and what this wealth is for and what it needs to do. And because they haven't engaged with trustees in multi-generational wealth in the past, they don't understand the concerns that trustees have, which are slightly different and sit around like management control, tax risk, asset protection, investment strategy. And he said, so there can be some really uncomfortable conversations about limitations and borders and structures that have to be put in place. And because they're, as trustees, looking around the corner and seeing what's coming, and their experience lends them to have to, speak in those terms. So anyway, that's Paul. As far as the philanthropy piece, I do think that the challenge that a lot of philanthropic organizations have is that entrepreneurial wealth has been made with a problem solution focus. You build a business to solve a problem, it's very successful. So they oftentimes look at impact through the lens of social enterprise and venture capital for impact and impact investing, and less through traditional NGO approaches. And so it takes quite a bit of education to show how you can have fun, sexy venture philanthropy and use those assets in a really fulfilling way. And it doesn't necessarily look like your grandparents' philanthropy. So I think that it requires, as Sally said earlier, that very purpose-driven, holistic approach to the wealth. And I think Matt sees it too, that it integrates purpose all across the planning. So I do think it's a super exciting time. It's just going to look different.
Ethan, I mean, what's your perspective on donors, perhaps younger donors? Is that, I don't know what the donor profile is, guys, but what's your view on this area about different types of people getting involved in philanthropy?
Well, and I think it gets back to George's question, specifically. The donors are critical to the support that the foundation or the charity provides to the hospitals. We fundraise for the hospitals, and then we can pump prime with the assets of the portfolio. I think the involvement of donors is really exciting. I think the science with which you see people promoting and executing on their philanthropic objectives is very helpful. It provides that level of engagement that for families, which is key to the coherence that they bring, and by having coherence, they'll then be able to have those discussions about how to have impact and make purposeful investments. So I think that's very beneficial, and being involved in the process of donating money and how that is spent is, whilst it's, it adds a burden to the process that the organizations making use of the money have to go through. I think it's so beneficial for the donor and their education and their ability to be forward and effective and supportive of philanthropic causes. It's really worthwhile. And again, the not to step on Catherine's feet, but the two things I've seen in families that are really key to getting this right are going to be coherence and a governance structure. Through coherence, you can have this sense of shared purpose as a family, which allows you to have the conversations across generations about how you're going to pursue your purpose, whether it's impact investing or philanthropic donations, and having a governance structure in place to allow those conversations to take place in a safe and appropriate way that is professional and removed from family and emotional dynamics, I think could be very, very powerful. Not easy to get right, but super important to try and put in place.
Yeah, thank you, Ethan. I think it makes my job a bit easier, actually, if other people are explaining why these things are so critically important and beneficial.
Catherine, do you have a reflection on this area of the entrepreneurial wealth that's created, taste in philanthropy, and how that all dovetails into the way they invest?
Yeah, well, certainly picking up on the idea of the younger donors in particular, I think it's really important to understand, when you're listening to what they say, make sure that you're actually hearing them properly, because people can use a common language in very different ways. Beacon Collaborative actually did some research earlier this year looking at the language and the interactions younger donors have with charities, and the different meanings they can put behind words. And impact itself is actually one of the words they picked up on. And when a charity is talking about its impact, it's thinking, big picture, what it's ultimately trying to achieve. But actually, often when a younger donor is using that term, they're thinking about what specifically their money can do in practical terms. And if charities are trying to engage, or if you're in general trying to engage those younger family members in the discussion, it can be very important to understand what they mean, because otherwise you're going to miss the mark slightly if you think you're having a good conversation and you're just talking at cross purposes.
Okay, thank you. And Sally, just as we come into the end of this hour, we've had a really interesting conversation covering a huge amount of ground. What are your closing thoughts and takeaways as we wrap up this session?
Gosh.
Sorry to put you on the spot there.
No, not at all. It's been a really, really rich discussion. And I think what it shows is that it's an ecosystem where you need the help and support of experts, advisors, like we have on the panel today, because getting your head around it is not easy if you haven't done this before. And the analogy I would say is when I started to listen to people talking to me about crypto and cryptocurrencies, and I think, gosh, I am 110 in the shade. When am I ever going to understand this? And it just takes time and patience. And it is different languages. To your point, Catherine, people talk a different language. And I think that give it time, start in small bits, reach out. Lots of other people want to share their experiences. I think that's one of the great things right now. And yeah, watch this space. It's going to grow and grow.
Interesting final comment here from George King on the chat, just saying all investing has impact. The fact that you don't measure it or know what it is, that's up to you. But I think it's a very, very interesting point, and a good note to close on. So thank you very much for the panel today. Excellent discussion. Thank you to Acorn Capital Advisers for proposing this session. Thank you for joining, and I wish